Hello and welcome to our screencast on the cardiovascular system. So today we're going to do a quick overview of what I mean by the cardiovascular system, and then we will look mostly at one of the two components of that. And I don't want to spoil the drama because the very next slide says what are the components and functions of the cardiovascular system. So I'm guessing you've heard of cardiovascular system before, and there's actually two body systems that kind of work together within this. And any guesses what those two are? Shout it out at home, shout it out. Hopefully you said the respiratory system and the circulatory system. Unfortunately, budget cuts at this point have forced me to cut back on the quality of diagrams available to me. So this is kind of what you can expect for the rest of the course. That was a joke. So what are the functions of the respiratory and circulatory systems? Well, the respiratory system's main job is gas exchange, which supports cellular respiration. Now, you may remember we talked a little bit about cellular respiration in our last unit on muscles. We talked about how cellular respiration is one of three ways in which cells make ATP, and this is the one that provides energy for endurance, and that just kind of keeps us going. But this process was aerobic, meaning it requires oxygen. And so here we have the chemical formula for cellular respiration. It takes glucose, which is the fuel, plus oxygen, and it produces carbon dioxide and water. And the energy released during that breakdown of the sugar into carbon dioxide and water is used to make ATP. So this formula is actually going to be our guiding principle here for the second half of this course. And in this unit, we're going to be focusing mostly on the oxygen part and the carbon dioxide part, because the whole point of the respiratory system is gas exchange. It brings in oxygen and it gets rid of CO2. Shockingly, amazingly, the only reason why you have lungs in your body is to support this process right here. Your lungs take in the oxygen, gets rid of the CO2. So that kind of indicates just how important this process is for giving you the energy you need to power yourself. The circulatory system's main job is to distribute materials through the body. Circulatory system consists of the heart, the blood vessels, and then of course the blood itself. And so these structures work together to just move things around. So here's some things that it moves around. Gases, that oxygen and CO2 are transported to all your body cells through the bloodstream. And so in that way, it supports the respiratory system. Nutrients are distributed. When you eat food, the food gets absorbed into the bloodstream and is distributed to all your cells. So it supports the digestive system. Waste products from all your cells are dumped into the bloodstream where they eventually can be urinated out. So it supports the urinary system. Hormones are transported through the bloodstream, so it supports the endocrine system. Immune cells are transported, so it supports the immune system. So you can see the circulatory system is pretty central in helping the body do the things that it needs to stay alive. So with that intro, we're going to turn to the first of the two systems that make up the cardiovascular system, and that is the respiratory system. So we're going to kind of use this diagram as our guiding principle, and the goal is to understand when oxygen enters your lungs, what are all the structures that it passes through on its way to the lungs? And that's sort of our goal. So before we get to that, I just want to talk about how we just move air into our body to begin with. And the answer is through breathing. I'm guessing you knew that. But how do we breathe? Well, there's two main muscles that are involved. And note that both are skeletal muscles, meaning they're voluntary. So this kind of throws some kids sometimes. Well, wait a minute, I don't have to think about breathing. I just do it. And that's true. But if you take a deep breath, you can control your breathing. You can hold your breath. You can stop breathing. You can take deep breaths, take shallow breaths. So you do have control, but most of the time your brainstem automatically stimulates this muscle, so you don't need to think about it. But because you can control it, it is considered a skeletal or a voluntary muscle, and it is in fact a skeletal muscle. So the first of these muscles that help you breathe is the diaphragm. And it's shaped like a parachute here. It kind of attaches to the base of the rib cage, and it kind of goes up and over like that. So the way I like to model this, if you do the sliding filament theory thing that we did before, where those those filaments kind of slide past one another. You basically just do that with your hands and then rotate it like that, and you've got this nice little dome shape. That's the diaphragm. It sits right below your rib cage. The other muscles involved are the intercostals. These are located between your ribs, and you can kind of see that they're attached in between each of these. And again, if you ever fire up the grill and have some ribs, you're eating the intercostal muscles of whatever critter you're eating. So how does this work? Well, it's kind of a pressure volume thing. And maybe you remember in chemistry that if volume goes up, pressure goes down. And the way it works is when the diaphragm contracts, if you do that sliding filament, as it contracts, as they slide, the diaphragm actually lowers in your chest cavity. So it goes, if you look at my picture in the corner, I'll do it again. And so what's happening is the volume of the chest cavity goes up, and that makes the pressure go down. And if the pressure goes down, air from the outside just kind of naturally rushes in to that low pressure area. And so it's actually this diaphragm creating this increased volume in the chest cavity that causes air to come in. The intercostal muscles help a little bit with this, but it's largely the diaphragm that does this. Fun fact, the way a boa constrictor kills you or its prey is that it squeezes you and it prevents your chest cavity from expanding. So when you take a deep breath and exhale, your chest cavity kind of shrinks down, and it shrinks down, and then the snake cinches around you and doesn't let you expand anymore. And then you try and take another little breath, and you exhale and it tightens more, and you exhale and it tightens more, and pretty soon you can't. You're just like trying to get air into you, but you can't change the volume of your chest cavity anymore, and as a result, you can't get air in, and then that's what actually kills you. So fun, tragic fact for you. The joke's on them, though. Oftentimes, once they kill a human, they have a hard time swallowing it because they go head first and they can't get past our shoulders. So take that, snake. Regulation of this process. So the way breathing is regulated is it detects CO2 levels. Now, think back to when we looked at the senses. What kind of sensory receptor might be involved in detecting a chemical? Remember what type it was? Remember there was mechanoreceptors, photoreceptors, and what was it? Yes, chemoreceptors. So to regulate breathing, there are chemoreceptors that detect CO2 levels in your body. And those those chemoreceptors are located in these little patches in the blood vessels in your neck, and in what's called the arch of the aorta, which comes out of your heart. And so there's these little sensory receptors that detect CO2 levels and then send a signal to your brain. And that's how your brain knows what CO2 levels are doing in your body. Now, you may remember from when we looked at the brain, what part of the brain does the basic physiological stuff that kind of helps determine if you, basic things like breathing and heart rate and stuff like that. Do you remember? It's part of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata. So when these chemoreceptors, again in the aorta and then that blood vessel in your neck called the carotid artery, when they send signals to the brainstem, that causes your brainstem to send signals to your intercostal muscles and to your diaphragm and affect breathing. So if your CO2 levels in your body go up, that causes you to breathe more. And this should make sense because if you go for a run, for example, your body's doing more cellular respiration, that's kicking out CO2. That rise in CO2 is detected by these chemoreceptors. They send a signal to the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata says, breathe more. And that's why when you're exercising, you breathe more. And I just talked about that. So I think at that point, I'm going to pause this screencast and we'll start another one that tracks the movement of air once we do take a breath and follows that air into your body.